So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Royal Society. My name's Julie Maxton. I'm the CEO of the Society, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome you to this Cara lecture on philanthropy and leadership in a changing world. As you know, we have Jeremy Farrar here tonight, and it's a privilege to welcome him, but he's a fellow of the Society, so he's no stranger here. So everybody knows that Jeremy is the director of the Wellcome Trust, and he's dedicated his career to protecting and improving global health. But before I hand over to Sir Jeremy, I want to briefly outline the order of tonight's event and how you, the audience, can get involved. We'll begin with some opening remarks from Professor Robin Grimes, who is the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society. He will then hand over to Jeremy. Following the lecture, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. We welcome both those in the room and those of you watching online to participate using Slido. So we're asking everybody to use Slido so that it's a level playing field, so that the people in the room aren't preferred to the people who are elsewhere. And the rule is you go onto slido.com and you join using hashtag P2411 or scan the barcode on the screen. Following the Q&A, Michael Worton, sitting there in the middle, who's the chair of Cara, will offer some closing remarks. So now I'll hand over to Robin Grimes.
Well, you're going to be a welcome to the Royal Society by all sorts of people tonight, and you are, of course, very welcome indeed. And this is the 9th Science and Civilisation Lecture. It's a series that brings together leading academics, writers, philosophers, and other renowned public figures to discuss important questions related to academic freedom. Now, it takes its name from a lecture given by Einstein in October 1933 at a major fundraising event on behalf of the Council for At-Risk Academics and actually 3 other organisations. And they come together as the Refugee Assistance Fund to help those expelled from Germany by the Nazis. The Royal Society are delighted to partner with Cara on this event, who of course, carry out really crucial, vital work in ensuring at-risk academics can seek refuge from violence, conflict and persecution and reach a place where they can continue their work in safety. And I'm very pleased indeed to welcome our friends and colleagues from Cara back to the Society. Now, we believe that academic and scientific freedom underpin excellent science, and that, of course, therefore, benefits all of humanity. However, as you're all aware, these are challenging times for academic freedom. And all around the world, some increasingly authoritarian regimes and political movements have placed increasing pressure on already at-risk academics and have undermined their protections. Thus, the Society has published a statement on the need to support academic freedom, and it makes clear what we consider academic freedoms to be and how they are central to the practice of science. So it defines what academic freedom is, both for individuals and institutions, and it highlights what threats to that freedom are and what they will look like now and in the future. Society also currently holds the chair of the UK Academy's Human Rights Committee, which brings together all the academies across the UK to advocate for the academic freedom and individual rights of researchers. We also attempt to raise awareness of these issues more broadly. We also consider what responsibilities those freedoms bring. So the two things, of course, go very much together. Now, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had a devastating impact on that country and to its academics. Academic freedoms in adjacent countries are also under threat. Now, on Ukraine specifically, We directly and strongly support the initiative led by the British Academy and Cara, and that's already found homes in the UK for well in excess of 120 displaced academics and their families, and that number is increasing monthly. We've also joined with the National Academies of Ukraine, Denmark, Germany, Poland, and the US, and set out practical steps that can be taken to rebuild a modern and globally integrated science and research system in Ukraine. The statement also recognises the challenges in making progress given the ongoing situation in Ukraine and highlights actions that can be taken. Now, we hope by working with also UUKI on the institutional twinning scheme that we will be able to provide opportunities for human capital development that will make a real contribution to the future resilience of Ukraine. And then finally, a little bit of advertising here, in March 2023, the Royal Society will lead a session at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, which is in Washington, and that will be called Supporting Scientists at Risk Now and in the Future. Now, I'm delighted to hand over to Sir Jeremy Farrar, who has been at the heart of the global fight against COVID-19. As head of Wellcome, Jeremy was one of the first people to hear about that mysterious new disease coming from China and to realize that it could spread rapidly between people. An attendee of SAGE, the emergency group, Jeremy was a key figure in both the UK science advisory system but also the World Health Organization, where he played a decisive role in forming critical decisions that were taken to meet the rapidly evolving threat of that pandemic. Now, Spike, the virus versus the people, which I suspect we might hear a little bit about shortly, is Jeremy's widely acclaimed inside story. And the book has been shortlisted for the Royal Society's Science Book Prize. Of course, there's going to be some stiff competition there, you do know that. Anyway, it sets out his reflections on the pandemic and casts light on the UK government's processes to be said to follow the science. So it's very interesting indeed. So the book is informed not just by Jeremy's views, but by interviews with other top scientists and political figures, and puts those forward his ideas and on how the world can be better prepared to tackle the inevitable future threats. Jeremy's experience of collaboration, particularly with China on the global issues and leading one of the world's largest research funders, and his extensive experience of international collaboration as a scientist make him ideally placed to talk about the importance of academic freedom in just such a collaboration. So, with no more ado, over to you, Sir Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Julie, and thanks very much indeed. It's a great pleasure, of course, to be here. I got an email, what feels like years ago, from Malcolm Grant, and Malcolm's been a long friend for many years, and we're alumni of a good university just at the top of Gower Street. But of course, when you get an email, firstly, it's from Malcolm, so you know you have to respond. But you also know it's so way in the future that you don't really need to think about it for some considerable time. And then a little bit before, I mean, not just in the last half hour, but you get closer to it, and then you actually look what the lecture's called, where it started, who's done it in the past, the organisation that it partners with. And no matter how many talks you give, it's terrifying to come then and give it. The last time I was in this room, actually, I mean, it is the Wellcome room, I think, isn't it? It is the Wellcome room. Last time I was in it, and I can't remember the year, I should remember the year, but actually was at the time when I was honoured to become a fellow at the Royal Society. And I remember standing actually at this podium. It may have been a different podium, but it was in this place. And I remember Mike Ferguson, another close friend, followed me. And that was soon after something called bird flu. I think it was about 2004, 2005, 2006, something like that, talking about the emergence of H5N1 in Vietnam, which is where I'd been working since 1995. and talking to the world about bird flu and H5 and the emergence and not being sure where H5 was going to go, and that they had at that time about a 60% human mortality. And here was a purely avian virus that clearly had got the ability to cross into humans. Thankfully, it didn't lead to a pandemic of humans. But here we are in 2022, and the global avian pandemic of the moment is H5N1. It doesn't get much attention, apart from the fact that Tesco's and Sainsbury's, if we're allowed to mention supermarkets, don't sell you eggs anymore, partially because all the chickens in the country and the turkeys coming for Christmas are all having to be housed indoors because of that pandemic. So whilst I will talk about COVID, and I'll talk about the context of COVID, we should remember that we are always at threat of the emergence of new infections. And I might argue, actually, that in 2022, we're a greater threat today than we've ever been in my professional career because of the state of geopolitics. And I'll come back to in a minute. So yes, some figure called Albert Einstein started this in 1933. Just a Cara, which I'm very proud as well to say Wellcome also supports now and has done over the last few years. Just to give you some figures of what Cara's doing, you may hear it later, but in 2020 to 21, I think you had 160 applications. In 21 to 22, you had well over 1,000. That's telling us something about the world and how it's changing. And if you go back to 1933, my father was 16 at that time. I am the first generation in my family that has not had to go to war. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father was a prisoner of war for 5.5 years from January 1940 to 1945. My wife, father, was a conscript in the Austrian army on the other side of the war. And they ended the war about 100 kilometers apart, one in a prisoner of war camp, one as a 16 or 17-year-old escaping as a conscript. Our children hold both British and Austrian nationalities and passports. We must never underestimate how important peace is in the world and how we are living in a very privileged generation in parts of the world, but that is not true everywhere. And as we have war in Europe and war in the Middle East and war in the Horn of Africa, we should just pause and think how fortunate we are to be in a country that may be politically challenged, although less now than a few weeks ago, but nevertheless, history is not done with. And if we don't take the privileges of our time seriously and make sure we protect those privileges and those freedoms, we should never, ever take them for granted. And I think we are going through a period, some people younger than me here, and there's some people a little bit more senior. I've never known another time in my life when there has been such a degree of uncertainty and such a degree of disruption to many, many parts of society and civilizations around the world. Pandemics, of course, and I'll come back to pandemics. But we have inflation. We have war in Europe, as I've said, and in the Horn of Africa and in the Middle East. We have the intergenerational challenges of a generation such as mine that could go to university for free. In fact, I was given a grant to go to university. I was given a train ticket to go home at weekends. I was given a book allowance and I could buy a skeleton on the government. Say that to my children of today, and they think I was living in a different, well, they mostly think I was living in a different era, but they think I was living in a completely different time zone. We have the climate crisis, which is a crisis, and yet we're incapable of seeing it as a crisis. It's something that will happen at some point in the future. Energy, water. We don't really often talk about water. With the change of climate, if the Mekong Delta becomes salinated or underwater, then millions of people in Southeast Asia will no longer have a livelihood. Economic and other migration. We have the loss of hope in some parts of the world and a loss of hope in the younger generation that actually the future will be brighter than the past. Again, since 1945, in many parts of the world, most generations have felt that the future was going to be brighter. That is not true in some generations and some parts of the world. Politics is as disrupted as I can ever remember it certainly in my life. Institutions are being called into question and are mistrusted. The financial crisis of 2008 is still playing through in 2022, and now we're going into and in the midst of yet another crisis. There is an issue of identity and nationalism. There is fear and inequality. And the challenge is that all of these, instead of happening in sequence, seem to be happening in confluence and at the same time. And if I focus on my own area of expertise, pandemics, these influences are no longer affecting one part of society or at one time point, but they are affecting the whole of society in ways that are far more disruptive than we thought. And there's a danger that we are losing the ability to both deal with today's big challenges, which there are, very many big challenges, but also think long term for how we will deal with the crises that we know are coming and will come even more if we allow inequality and infrastructure to be denuded and lessened. The challenge of the news cycle, the challenge all organisations are facing between the generational, racial issues, diversity issues, inclusion, a feeling of identity and not being valued. Things are very precarious and very fragile. There is fear and there is a thin resilience after 3 years now almost of the pandemic in individuals, in organisations, in countries, in alliances. I think I've, again, never known another time when resilience is so thin and so challenging. Don't worry, the talk will get a bit more optimistic towards the end. On to COVID. Thank you for mentioning the word spike. I would just like to call out my co-author, Anjana, who was such an integral part of that writing of that book. On COVID, which of course has dominated all of our lives and certainly dominated my life in the last 3 years or so, three things to say. One is, although we did not know it would be called COVID, although we did not know where it would start, although we did not know what type of virus it would be, the warnings have been there for many, many decades that something like that was going to happen. In fact, somebody who's online, Richard Peter, just emailed me to say he couldn't come because he'd got a cough, but he was listening to an interview I did in 2014, Life Scientific, talking about the coming pandemic. We knew it was coming, but we were unable, unwilling, and did not think about how we might prevent or be prepared if it were to come. The second is, it is not over. Sitting in this room today, let's say, I'd like to say there's 1,000 people, but let's say there's about 100 people, 150 people here. There's about 1 in 60 people today on the streets of London are infected with COVID. There's probably 2 people in this room currently infected with COVID. We've done enormously well to prevent severe disease, illness, hospitalizations and death with vaccines, therapies and diagnostic tests, but we have not stopped transmission. And if we do not stop transmission, with 1 in 60 people in the country infected, and presumably that's reflected across the world, then as population immunity varies, then we are inevitably going to have new variants, and we will inevitably see variants at some point which will be able to escape our treatments and our vaccines. And although I'm all in favour of the current approach to restrictions or the lack of restrictions, and I think societies have to get back to normal, and I'm not in favour, and in advice within China, certainly strongly advise against the continuation of zero COVID, which I don't think is sustainable or tenable. Nevertheless, somewhere, and this is where science has a critical role to play, it is critical that behind the headlines and behind the political notes, that some people somewhere are working on the assumption that these vaccines will not protect us forever, and we need to have vaccines which reduce transmission and stop us getting sick and ill. And that doesn't need to be shouted about, it doesn't need to be political policy, it doesn't need to lead to any restrictions in our movements, but we do need to make sure we're not just preparing for the most likely scenario, but we're preparing for every scenario. Science moved on in COVID in ways that, again, none of us predicted. If you'd asked me when I first heard of the outbreak on the 31st of December 2019, would we have a vaccine being given and in vaccination in somebody's arm in 2019, I'd have said no way. But the reality was, on the 10th of January 2019, I get the years right, 2019, the genome was released. And from that moment on, diagnostic tests could be done. And on the 11th of January, the vaccine program started along with the therapeutics program. And by the end of the year, as a result of phenomenal work from an amazing number of people all around the world, vaccines were available to the rich world. Unfortunately, those vaccines were not available to the rest of the world until too late. And the inequality that's been driven as a result of that vaccine inequality around the world has led to both public health issues, but also a sense of mistrust and inequality around the world. Today, again, there is a debate after the release of a series of emails about the origins of the virus, and I'm very happy to talk about the origins of the virus. My very strong view is that the virus origin is from a natural origin. It is, I believe, our very greatest threat, that zoonotic viruses are moving around the world all the time in huge numbers. We don't understand those viruses. We don't understand the mechanisms that protect the human race from those viruses, and we will be continuously at risk of animal viruses crossing the species barrier into humans. And unless we understand that barrier and how to prevent that, we will be at constant risk. Laboratories must absolutely be transparent and safe, and we started a program with the Nuclear Threat Initiative in 2017 to initiate a regulatory environment that allowed policing and auditing of laboratories such that all laboratories were safe. Both possibilities remain true, although I believe the overwhelming probability is that the origins of this virus is from an animal reservoir in wet markets in Wuhan, from an illegal animal trade that crosses many borders and is all pervasive in Asia and Africa and is worth many billions a year. Both are risks, but if we equate both risks with equal weight, I think we will be laying ourselves open to the natural risk at such a level that we will not be able to prevent the next pandemic. And COVID, like many of the other things I talked about at the start, from climate to energy to migration to water, COVID is another example which is not just about health. I talked in 2020, July, in an article in the Financial Times about the 4 circles of pandemics. The first circle is the direct health consequence, whether you get ill, whether you have to stay home, whether you go to hospital, or tragically you die. That's the inner circle. The second circle is the disruption to the whole of healthcare that results as a result of the COVID pandemic. Cancer care, diabetic care, people who are in social care homes, people with mental health issues. The third circle of the pandemic is the impact on economies, on society, on trust, on education, on interrelationships within families, between countries and elsewhere. And then the fourth circle is geopolitics and national politics. And I think now in, what are we now, November 2022, looking back on that article in July 2020, even I could not have predicted that those 4 circles would have been even bigger than I thought they would be at the time. Politics has changed nationally and globally. It's perhaps without a pandemic, who would have known what would have happened in the last US election? Who would have known what would have happened with the economics of the world had the pandemic not played through? The impact of these disruptive things are so enormous and so broad and all pervasive across the whole of society. We cannot, as a humanity, allow ourselves to not address them, not in the time of crisis, but in the time to make sure we're aware of what is happening, we can prevent them where we can, and we're better able to respond if inevitable crises occur. Because the sense that crises are coming at us somehow unknown is a misnomer. It's untrue. We can predict. We won't get them right. We won't know it was COVID. We would not know it was Wuhan. We wouldn't know the full implications. But we can look to the future and we can think, where are the probabilities of things happening and how can we make sure we use what we have available, and this is where science is just so critical, to make sure that we're better prepared, we're able to prevent, and we're able to respond. And COVID is just a symptom of a much wider set of issues that we have to address. COVID is the symptom, as was Nipah in 1999 in Malaysia, as was SARS-1 in Southeast Asia, as was H5N1 in Vietnam, as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome was in 2009, Zika in South America, and of course COVID now. These are the symptoms of underlying drivers in society, which are climate change, biodiversity loss, habitat loss, change of interface between humans and animals, urbanization, trade, travel, and exaggerating inequality. There's a very beautiful article just this week in Nature talking about how bats are looking for new habitats, and when they get hungry, because their old habitats go, the viral loads that they carry in them increases. That increases the risk that they will forage for food in places they wouldn't normally go, and when they're hungry, they're more likely to have higher viral loads. That is a terrifying thought. As you lose their natural habitats, that they will naturally gravitate to where food becomes available, which will often be where humans are, and therefore increasing the risk of transmission. And yet, in that doom and gloom on a really miserable November evening of rain and drizzle, we have never had more opportunities than we've had today. And I pull in my inherent Hans Rosling for anybody that knew him. The world is getting better. The world of my father, born in 1917, and mine is better. That is not true all over the world, but it's true in many, many parts of the world. We are going through a period of enlightenment where science, culture, the arts, humanities is actually not only showing a path forward, but actually can become more equitable. We have a much better understanding of what underpins all sorts of areas of not just biological sciences, but physics and maths, chemistry, of the arts, of humanities, of social sciences, of economics, even economics. We have a much better understanding of all of that. And yet somehow we have not been able to connect it together. There is a growing gap, I think, between scientists, Royal Society, of course, excluded from this comment. There's a growing gap between scientists and society. Science is going at such a pace now that the ability of society, diplomats, politicians, the media, my mother, my father, whatever it is, to understand where that science is going is diverging, I think, because the ability to keep up with it is so challenging, even for those of us in the world of science. I think we have to try and bring these back together again, and I would have a call out here for something I've been involved in since inception, grandly titled the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. What it's trying to do is look forward 5, 10, 20 years' time. What does being human mean? What is AI and quantum likely to do to us? What is the space impact on our daily lives likely to be? And how can we make sure not just the scientists are literate in that, but that we're all somehow literate in it, not only because we can therefore better grasp the opportunity, but we can also make sure that the opportunities are not stopped out of fear when it hits a regulator, it hits the government in a way that they cannot take on board and understand. Science really matters, and I think I've never been more optimistic about what science can do, and I think COVID demonstrated in one small part of science how that true is. But science is no longer enough. We have to reach out and think, where is science going? Not just communicate, but actually involve and engage and allow people access to where the world is going in order that the world can go there with the best way possible and bring the greatest benefits to the maximum number of people. So I think we're at one of those moments in history when things look very dark: pandemics, climate change, inflation, dodgy politics, economics that doesn't look very good, inequalities. And living through history, when you live through it, so remember something my father used to say, when you look back and you read those history books, sometimes it looks quite romantic. Sometimes it looks as if it was quite enjoyable. During time, he used to say it was miserable, it was horrible. And it feels a little bit like that now. At times like that, I think it's absolutely crucial for those of us with the privilege of agency to actually look beyond the darkness and say, where could we go? Where are the philosophers that we had in the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th century? What is the role of universities in pushing us forward, not in silos of their own areas and the next grant application from somebody, but what is the role of universities in challenging and questioning what that future lies? What is the role of foundations and the role of the Royal Society and others? To lift our eyes, not to ignore the problems of today. We must not do that. But I think we have to lift our eyes to the possibilities of tomorrow in a way that I fear modern politics in any political system is not going to be able to do, because the challenges of the news cycle, the challenges of the 24-hour cycle, and the very big challenges that every government faces at the moment. But somewhere, someone has to look beyond that and think, where do we want to be? Where do we want to go? Because the 21st century is going to throw up challenges that we cannot yet imagine. And they will have some common features, the ones I've talked about. They will also all be transnational. The challenges of the 21st century are not going to be national, from pandemics to climate change to energy to water use and everything else. They're going to be transnational, and yet we're going through a phase where nationalism is becoming more common and an inward-looking identity issue is becoming more common. I think we, as scientists, as communities engaged in science, as people here in this room and online, we have a responsibility to lift our eyes and say, what is a better future? The other thing my father did was he was an English teacher, and I was forced to read. I hate to admit it, but often these hung in the toilet where we lived in many parts of the world, having been born in Singapore and not come to this country until I was a teenager. And this one quote has always stayed with me. There is a tide in the affairs of man which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries, and on such a full sea we are now afloat, and we must take the current where it serves, or we'll lose our ventures. That was Brutus. It didn't turn out well in that play particularly, but I still love the quote, and I think that is where we are today. We are in the midst of a very, very difficult phase. We're coming out of a pandemic which has disrupted every single bit of society, all of us individually, all our families and all our organisations. But somewhere there has to be hope, and I believe that's science. Thank you very much.
Jeremy, thank you so much for that and for reminding us of such important matters and ending on a note of hope, which I think is very important. Now, it is time for questions, and I have a little device here which will tell me which questions have been asked. So I'm just waiting for them to come through. Remember, go to Slido, put in the little hashtag P2411, and we'll start taking the questions. So one of the first is, to what extent are you, Jeremy, able, in your capacity at the Wellcome, to use your voice and influence to advocate for academic freedom?
Yeah, I would also here pay tribute to my predecessors who I think led in many ways the push to open publishing, to ensuring that publication itself was not enough until it was also communicated, and making sure that there was academic freedom within the university sector, the academic sector, and where possible within the industrial sector. So I think Wellcome is in a position. Have we done it enough? And enough over the last few years? I would admit probably not. Academic freedom comes with some downsides. And Julia and I were talking before we came in, and as some people in the audience I know, the last 2 years, having spoken about things like COVID very openly, have led to really worrying threats, death threats, threats against family, threats against myself. We should not think that academic freedom doesn't come with a need for some protection as well. That is true in this country. It is far more true in other parts of the world where some people in this audience will be from. And academic freedom is critical, but so is making sure we protect academics when they are threatened or when they are abused.
Thank you very much. So we're going to take another question, which is from a completely different angle. The UN Secretary General mentioned the need for developed countries to support and help poorer countries as far as the vaccine is concerned. Yet responding to his call was slow. What do you think is the role of developed countries giving this slow response?
So there is a sort of conflict to declare here because I was very involved in setting up and then running something called the ACT Accelerator, which was the attempt through the World Health Organization to make available vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and enhance health systems. So the slowness I'm at least partially also responsible for. I think seeing the ability to make equitable access to vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, whatever it is, if you start that in a crisis, you will always be far too slow. And it's true actually across the whole of a crisis. If you get behind a curve of an epidemic, in fact of most things, you will never catch up with that curve because you can't move at the pace when, in my world of infections, something has this famous R of 2, 3, 4, maybe 8, 9, 10 now. It's too slow. So if the world is going to change the inequitable access, it's going to have to shift the centre of gravity to both where the science is done. Royal Society plays a huge role in that. And it's also going to have to shift the centre of gravity into where the manufacturing is. And if you want to do that in a crisis, you can't. The time to do that is now, and to make sure that is sustained over time by providing utility all the time. In other words, it's not an ivory tower which is set up, a ribbon is cut, and everyone feels happy and takes a photograph, but it's actually providing value and utility all the time. I think there is now an opportunity to do that, and I would here pay tribute. She's leaving, I think this week is her last day at the WHO, Dr. Sumia, who has led the calls for the setting up of vaccine hubs around the world, including in the continent of Africa. I think that deserves all our support.
Thanks very much. Questions are coming in quite regularly now. What more can universities, both in the UK and abroad, do to combat some of the transnational challenges you mentioned? What role can they play? I think universities and the broader sector, it's not just about universities, it's also about funders, it's about learned societies. I think this is something that actually universities do very well. I think they do it very well in this country. I think in the whole they do it very well around the world. And it really pains me in any political system, but it's also true here, when governments kick universities for all sorts of reasons. Universities are at the heart of enlightenment, they're at the heart of progress. I also believe in this country and around the world, they're at the heart of this so-called levelling up agenda. The opportunities we get from whatever background we came from through the universities is crucial. And all universities, I think, play a role, not just in their local communities, which is critical, but also in playing a role in making the case that the challenges of the 21st century are transnational. Thank you. I'll just take another question, which is on the same kind of theme. Do you think UK-based organisations, such as funders, scientific societies, publishers, should be playing a greater role in inclusion of the global south in the scientific endeavour? Yeah. I guess there are some harder questions to come, which may be more absolutely right. It's a phrase which I know people at Wellcome, if you're online, get really fed up with me hearing, but I think it is about the shift in the centre of gravity. It is about questions being asked, decisions being made, peer reviewing processes for grants is shifted, and the sense of ownership is shifted. I do think the UK, through what was DFID, I hope it remains true in the FCDO, has actually played a leading role in support for low and middle income countries. And I really regret the fall from 0.7 to 0.5 as UK government supports. And I dearly hope that the DFID ethos and commitment to evidence remains true now that it's incorporated into the Foreign Office. But universities, funders have got a role to play in that. Here I'd call out two things I've been involved in over the last few years, one of which we were on the call with this morning, called the India Alliance, where the system and Julie and Dr. Vijay from India have played such a critical role in this, is shifting the transparency, the peer reviewing processes, the quality, the feeling that if you're on this university and you're reviewed by somebody from that university, there will be a level playing field. I think that India Alliance with the Department of Biotechnology in Delhi has been transformative and hugely positive. And I'd like also to call out the Science for Africa program, actually based in Nairobi,
Many people fund that. We do, and many others do. I would love to see that as the model for going forward and shifting the stuff out of London, Geneva, Washington, Paris, Seattle to where the needs are the greatest. Because I think until you own the questions, the answers, the reviewing processes, and then the implementation, I don't think you could. That is not, sorry to go on, that is not a risk to the high excellence and quality of, let's say, UK universities. This is not a choice of one or the other. I think you can have both. Excellent.
Questions are getting harder, Jeremy. How about trying this one? How, in practical terms, can scientists give politicians and diplomats the kind of scientific understanding they will need this century if the gap between science and society is growing?
Somebody from a science background that chooses not to pursue a full-time career in science and moves into policy making should be celebrated. If we as scientists all stay, as I have done until 2013, in the scientific arena, and that is the only career that any of us value and celebrate and give kudos to, I fear we will lose the policy and political and diplomatic, very important, to others who are all lovely people, but may not quite get R0 or quantum or AI, and I think that's crucially important. So I think scientists, as scientists, I speak for myself here, we can't complain about political and policy decision-making if we're not part of the process. So my plea would be to get involved. And for those of you in very senior positions who are mentoring others, don't portray that shift as for those that can't quite make it in the scientific world. There is a fantastic opportunity there to get involved and for the very best amongst you to do that. Because if we leave it, we can't then complain. There's no point throwing stones at the glass house from outside. So my plea would be to get involved and engage. That's not just true about policy, it's true about the media, it's true about teachers, it's true about education. And the more that we can get involved, the better, and the sooner we do that, the better. Because I fear we're diverging, because the knowledge base around the scientific agenda is going at such a pace now, it's even possible, even just a little bit outside your own field, to keep up with it. So how do we expect somebody coming out and into the political and policy arena didn't even have any of our backgrounds, your backgrounds, to then catch up? Something I'm passionate about.
Excellent. In a somewhat similar vein, you talked about the current state of politics. What role do you think science and scientists have for challenging where we are politically? For example, on the dangers of populism and some of the anti-science rhetoric we see.
Well, firstly, populism hasn't developed whatever you think populism is. It might be your popular view or my popular view. Populism hasn't evolved in an abstract or in a vacuum. It's evolved because, rightly or wrongly, people were able to offer apparently populist agendas because of issues that we, in our elite world, have chosen to ignore. So my answer to that would not be to say populism is all wrong, but let's address the issues that drove to that populist agenda rather than just saying you're all wrong. And again, to me, that comes back in actually making sure that we are involved in that political debate. Science is political. It's not party political necessarily, but it's certainly political. And to think that it's somehow naive and innocent and just going on in a nice way and independent of what is happening in the rest of society, I think is nonsense.
Very good. You spoke of an interconnected world, but knowledge generation is fragmented, split by disciplines. There's been talk of transdisciplinarity for 50 years, but we see little of it. Your views, please.
I don't suppose he will be online, but there's a few people in the room as well. My PhD supervisor's here for some reason, which I'm very pleased to see. But I would just call out somebody that I worked for in Edinburgh in some point in the 1980s. Who was the first person. I remember where I was sitting at the time. There are certain moments in your life when you just remember you heard something which was profound. And because I originally trained as a neurologist. There was a character in Edinburgh called Charles Warlow. Some of you may know. Charles said to me, I remember in some annual appraisal review, just remember, Jeremy, the really interesting place of science is at the interfaces between things that don't realise they overlap. And I remember him telling me, I remember the chair I was sitting in, and that must have been something like 87 or 88 after I graduated. And that has stayed with me. Two things to comment on there. I strongly believe that to be true. The most exciting science I've done has been when I've been working with people who are not naturally in the sweet spot of where my knowledge is. That's been the most exciting area of science. And the second comment I'd make, that is over 30 years ago, and that is the importance of mentorship. That has stayed with me all of those years and drove a lot of the things I've done. So another plea, mentorship is hugely important. And you should also thank your mentors at some point, because most of them are getting towards a certain age when, you know, you may not see them that much longer again. Charles is very well, by the way. But A, mentorship is critical, particularly to all of us, even to people my age or older. Secondly, appreciate your mentors, because they play such an important life and their comments stay with you for decades.
Now, I should have said that there are lots of compliments coming in as well for your talk. Lots of people describing it as inspirational and a very, very nice talk. So that's just by way of coming to this question. Nothing demonstrates the growing divergence between science and government than the battles Kate Bingham had to fight to persevere with her task. Why was she not more publicly defended by the scientific establishment through the process? What could have been done better?
How long have we got?
A little while yet.
So I'm either certainly agnostic, if not an atheist, but Kate deserves sainthood at some point. A, because of what she did on vaccines, that was quite important, but for how she dealt with the political system. And she's written about it. If you haven't read her book, I would strongly encourage you to do so. The Wellcome bookshop's opening soon, so it'll be available through there and all best retailers, I'm sure. Kate's book is an eye-opener. She claims she was blunt and to the truth. I think the truth was even a little bit more worse than she thought it was. But Julia, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is in a crisis, what you have before you go into a crisis is just so critical. And if that isn't and does not have any emotional and intellectual inside you, sort of visceral understanding of complex scientific things, I don't think we can expect the whole system to suddenly understand the importance of what anybody, including Kate, was able to get across. So again, if you want to respond to a crisis, don't look at what you've got on the first day of the crisis. Look what you had and was functional in the week, the year, the month, the decade beforehand. And if you undermine those institutions and structures, they will not be there when you need them. And the second is to make sure that you don't see those as some sort of thing you have on a shelf and you take off the shelf when you need it. Those things have got to be functional all the time. They've got to be providing utility all the time. They've got to be providing benefit, because otherwise they'll never, ever be sustained. And I think what the challenge, I don't want to speak for Kate, I'll speak more personally, the challenge we had, and I pay absolute tribute here to the role of Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty throughout the pandemic, the great challenge was coming into a system, semi from the outside, into a system that couldn't quite accept what was being said. Yep. Let's fix the system rather than thinking you'll put that right next time round if we continue with the same system. If you use the same system again, you'll end up with the same result.
So I'm going to put two questions together here in the next one because they're kind of similar. Again, compliments to you for the talk. You talked about all the warning signs for a pandemic, which turned out to be COVID-19, yet we didn't do enough. What should we have done? How hard did we, as scientists working in emerging infections, push for these changes? Are we doing enough now? And the second question, which I think is similar, what do you think going through the COVID pandemic has prepared us for upcoming pandemics? What's the most important lesson that the latest pandemic taught us?
I'll start with the last one because it's still in my memory. These don't come out of, I don't think it's been reported anyway, but they don't come out of space. They come from here. Overwhelmingly, they come from the animal sector and into the human community, but across the species barrier. We need to. I don't think we are better prepared today than we necessarily were in 2019, although we've made enormous progress in things like RNA technologies and all of those sorts of things. But if we don't continue to invest in those, if we don't continue to use those, if we don't make them part of our health and scientific systems in the future, I'll promise you what will happen is what's happened after every epidemic that I've been involved in since Nipah virus in 2019, is everybody will talk about it for about a year or two, or maybe 3, and then gradually it'll slip off the agenda. And the only way to avoid that, in my view, is to make sure what you're doing is bringing value all the time. That might be scientific knowledge. It might be pushing the barriers of science. It may be very fundamental science that allows us to understand whatever it is that we're looking, from viruses to astrophysics and everything. Investment in basic science is absolutely critical, as is investment in making sure we've got the tools available through competent health systems, surveillance, and that we can make the interventions that we need, whether therapeutic, diagnostic, or vaccines. And around all of that, as we've seen in the pandemic, if you don't incorporate social sciences and understanding of communication, trust, and communication into politics and into society, you can have all the tools you want, but they won't be used.
Yeah. Another question about the scientific endeavour, really. Do you think we've made progress in making the public comfortable with uncertainty?
I don't know that I've made progress in making myself uncomfortable or comfortable with uncertainty. We are going through a very uncertain time, and we've been through a period in many parts of the world, actually, of reasonable certainty. And I think that's one of the challenges we've got. We've gone from a period, even if it didn't feel it at the time, of relative certainty. We've now in a period of quite profound uncertainty, and that is very difficult to cope with. That is a little bit what I'm talking about when I say we've got to raise our eyes and we've got to look to the future, and how can we return a bit of certainty to people's lives in a more equitable way than we had before. But that demands all of us, I think, to realise, going back to your comment about populism, what drove why we are where we are today. And if we don't address those the fundamental underpinnings of inequality, of lack of opportunity, etc., then we will not be able to address the challenges that we face in the future.
Oh, it's a slightly different angle. Can scientists and leaders in higher education do more to challenge the ongoing hostile environment towards forced migrants and those seeking sanctuary in the UK?
I might turn to my right to a much more informed answer on that. Language is really important. It's amazing how I lived 20 years in Vietnam, and whilst there, people, friends and family, or not family, but friends of the family, etc., used to call me an expat. If you're here, you're a migrant. Those words tell you everything about how things are seen. Do you remember, sorry, I can't remember the year, but I remember the picture of that horrific picture of a child on a beach in Greece, dead. It moved us all for a week, a month, a year. And yet, in a newspaper I respect and like and read regularly, just last week, somebody died, and the headline in a newspaper I respect was, "A migrant being processed died." That's inhumane. That is not the world we want. And who's going to argue for that when there is such an argument in favour in identity politics of us and them? Just remember where this series started in 1933. That's not the world we want. But unless we argue for it, unless we are courageous enough to argue for something different, we will lose what we have. These things are very fragile. Who would have thought in my generation coming through who I could not conceive, use that word, that the United States would overturn Roe versus Wade. But it happened. The pendulum was reset. The pendulum was reset, and then suddenly you think that's the norm, that's the midpoint. And you wake up one Tuesday and you think, how on earth did we get there? Let's not get there. Let's raise our voice in the warnings of pandemics or what the world is going to, and raise the voices before that pendulum is reset, because once the pendulum is here, it's bloody difficult to put it back there. And the complacency of all of us in allowing pendulums to reset, I think, is one of the greatest dangers we face.
Now, we were speaking before you came in tonight about China and working with China. But the question I have here is a short but pithy one. Any ideas on how to persuade the Russians to come back to the party?
I can cope with China. I don't understand China, but I have worked in China for much of my life, since 2009, since 1995 and before that. I can't comment on Russia. I cannot comment on one European country that chooses to invade another and inflicts such suffering on a sovereign nation. I find that very difficult to understand, and to contemplate how one does reach out at some point, both in Ukraine and in Russia. That one is way above my pay grade. But at some point, I suspect we will have to reach out. I know there's a lot of controversy about China, origins of the virus, etc., etc. But with China, which I know more about, China seems the competitor, China seems the invasion of the South China Sea, the Taiwan, etc. I do believe that science has got a role to play in reaching out to those parts of the world that may seem wrong. I don't believe Russia is there today, and I don't believe that's possible. But I hope it becomes possible at some point, and science, I think, has got a role to play in that.
Now, I'm going to take you back to the pandemic, and I'm going to make this the last question. And I'm sorry for those of you who've asked questions, but I think Jeremy's given us 25 minutes of answers to questions, and I could take him all over the place with the questions I've got. In fact, I think I probably have already a little. But here's the final question, Jeremy. Why did we not see sociologists, cultural analysts, and ethicists flanking the Prime Minister during the COVID crisis? The difficult matters you've identified are surely social and ethical in nature.
I would ask the Prime Minister that question if I was you.
Well, we have to be quick before we get another change, I suppose, to do that.
I think it's a really good question. This is as I've said before, but both Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty, and many of the others that appeared there, I think, under incredibly difficult circumstances, which will probably never be fully known, I think did an absolutely staggering job. But SAGE in itself and the people that were there, certainly in the early days of SAGE, was not diverse enough in terms of the input into it, including but not limited to the social sciences and beyond. And as the COVID pandemic has demonstrated in every single community, in every single society, if you don't embrace that, you will not, doesn't matter how many vaccines you'll have, you'll not solve the problem. And that has to be, to the earlier question, what are we going to have to do differently in the future? If you try and integrate social science and social scientists, whatever that means, because I'm never quite sure what social science means in terms of who's in it, but if you try and integrate that into, in my world of biomedical, in a crisis, again, you'll always fail, because we are training people too young to go into their silos. And you're defining yourself, certainly in this country, usually at the age of 15 or 16, which sort of track you're going in. Your language, your culture, your interests change and diverge and diverge and diverge, and trying to regain that at some future date is really difficult. So it's not that social scientists should suddenly have been popped into place in Downing Street during the pandemic. The lesson to me is let's stop thinking of social science as something we add on at a later date when we want to get a vaccine into a community. But it's about the interfaces that we create in our education systems and beyond now, rather than in a crisis.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I'll come back with my final thanks, but meantime, I'm going to ask Michael Worton to come up to the lectern and to offer some closing remarks.
Thanks, Julie. That really was an enormously illuminating and thought-provoking and at times enormously moving lecture, for which I think we're all very, very grateful, Jeremy. And from a Cara point of view, I think that you've actually raised all kinds of, you've touched on areas which we think about and then don't think on about. For instance, when you were talking about the fact that if you like, we're always at risk of new infections, we also know in what we do that there are always going to be new conflicts, and yet that's not something that we prepare for. Your point about the importance of preparation was, I think, so important, and it's one of the things, in fact, that we at Cara are thinking about at the moment. How can we actually plan better in what is essentially a reactive world where we are reacting to crisis? How do we actually prepare for that? How do you prepare for Ukraine when you thought you were preparing for Afghanistan after Yemen or Syria, whatever? And also, I think that your point about interdisciplinarity, working across disciplines, transdisciplinarity, what I like to think of as radical interdisciplinarity rather than purely the cognate interdisciplinarity that just nudges us forward a little bit. We do need to be in the radical space. But that's one thing that we can do and that we're increasingly doing in our regional programs. So in the Iraq program, the Zimbabwe program, now in the Syria program, where we are more intervening ourselves in actually the training of at-risk academics as we try and bring them into the world of global science and research. And it's interesting how difficult it is, especially for people in the Middle East, to understand. Or indeed in South Asia, and especially in Southeast Asia, issues of resistance to the blurring of titles and of disciplines and so on. And above all, for us certainly in the Middle East, the big issue of trying to get people to understand the real importance of research ethics, and that it's not a question of just filling in a form and ticking boxes or not ticking boxes, but actually thinking through. So I think you've set us off thinking a lot about actually, in the hopeful bit at the end, you've given us hope that, the things that you said have certainly triggered in me, and I'm sure in my colleagues, indications of how we can perhaps actually respond better, certainly more swiftly, as you indicated that science has to respond. We know we have to respond swiftly, but then we don't know how do we actually respond more swiftly than we do because we don't have money. The great advantage of a charity, as you've said somewhere else, is that a charity can be fairly nimble, can be fairly fast-moving, but when you're a small one dependent on others, we've got to follow the money as well, or at least try and persuade others that the urgency is really upon us. But we do undoubtedly owe you an enormous debt for this evening. So thank you very much on behalf of Cara. I think you will see the thinking that you have shared with us today actually beginning to have effect in the way we move forward. And notably, again, with your point about shifting centres of gravity. And also thank you for the $500,000 that you're giving us over the next 3 years, for which we are enormously grateful. But I would like to thank also our partner in hosting the lecture, the Royal Society. It's always a pleasure to work with the Royal Society. It's wonderful to come here. And while my kind of more natural home is along the street at the British Academy, I always feel I'm coming into hallowed portals when I come through the door of the Royal Society. There's always something very special about this ancient and marvellously modern institution. I would just like to thank a few other people. One is, if you like, the collective universities of the UK, who are our main partners, and there are a few people from universities here. Without the UK universities, we couldn't really do what we do. All of the fellows that we bring, that we rescue, we bring to the sanctuary of UK universities, and we're all enormously proud of the way that the UK universities keep finding ways of helping us more, constantly. And also the fact that academics and professional services colleagues in universities keep coming to volunteer with us. We now have nearly 1,000 people from working in UK universities who are working with us on our programs, the fellowship program, the Syria program, or whatever. It is quite astonishing just to see how much compassion and also how much concern there is for academic freedom still very vibrant in this country. I despair at times about where we are with academic freedom in the UK, I must admit, and certainly when governments try to interfere with it, my despair grows ever more dark. But one of the things about working in Cara is that for a lot of the people, for perhaps the majority of the people that we are trying to rescue and help them to find a new life, actually academic freedom is genuinely, not literally, not figuratively, not emotionally, it is physically a question of life and death. And when we kind of fuss on about wokeness and so on, let's just remember that actually we need to go back to the reality of what life and death means when you are actually trying to express yourself. We are enormously fortunate to work with so many partners, and I think one of the great things that happened over the last decade, but especially over the last 3 years, has been how Cara has been changed as an organisation through the many, many, many partnerships that we have, who are all bringing in very, very different principles, different perspectives. And so we're actually becoming an organisation which is constantly obliged to rethink everything that we think of as core. So thank you to all of the universities and their leaders, and also thank you to all of the many volunteers and to our many other supporters. There's one last thank you I'd like to make, which is one which is heartfelt, that Malcolm Grant thanked earlier for his intervention in hooking Jeremy to come along this evening. But Malcolm is stepping down as our president next month. He has been a marvellous champion of Cara, always an ever-wise counsellor to us, an indefatigable networker on our behalf. And I was thinking as Jeremy came into his coda of the lecture, and we began to see, if not sunlit uplands, we were at least seeing kind of some rays of optimism. Malcolm has always been a wonderful voice of sanity and a wonderful voice of optimism. So thank you so much, Malcolm. We shall miss you. And we shall think of you in the sunlight uplands of New Zealand as we go into our next meeting. I'd just like to remind you a little bit about Cara, and I'm only going to speak for 3 or 4 minutes on this, but we quite often talk about the fact that we go back to 1933 to bringing people out of Nazi Germany. But we are, on the one hand, we are a rescue mission, rescuing people who are at risk of oppression throughout the world, wherever they are. And the key priority for us is the level of their risk. That is absolutely what is fundamental. And we have chosen not to be a campaigning group, not to be an advocacy group, but just to help those who are persecuted for whatever reason, be it faith, ethnicity, political position, for whatever reason. It is the risk they are under because of who they are that brings them to our attention. The other thing which we have been developing increasingly over the last 15 years, but which was very much in our founders' view was advancing higher education with a view to advancing it globally. One of the ways that we do this is, of course, by bringing people over here to work in the West, mainly in the UK, but also increasingly we're finding placements in Western Europe, in Canada, and so on. But it's terribly important for people to see what life is like in kind of Western modes of research. But the strengthening mission is one where we are supporting academics who are in exile from their countries, but are still living in the region. So at the moment, we run a Syria program, which is essentially based in Turkey for the Syrians who are in exile from Syria itself. It launched in 2016, is still running and providing Syrian exiles with opportunities to develop. But we also have to think about where are we going next? What is coming next? This time last year, we didn't know Afghanistan was going to come. And then there was an enormous amount of compassion shown by UK universities. We were astonished at how the universities responded to our request to them to help us more in helping us, if we could ever get Afghans out of the country, to come to us. Quite astonishing what they did. And then people have forgotten about Afghanistan because the Ukraine came, and the Ukraine is much, much more difficult for some people. One of the issues that some of our fellows raise with us is, why is it so easy for a Ukrainian to come to the UK than it is for a Syrian or a Yemeni or a Myanmar inhabitant? And it's true. Why have we responded in a very different way to Ukraine than we have with Afghanistan? Afghanistan was essentially, we're going to give ourselves a small window to bring people out who are useful to us, who have been useful to us, who are us, and a few dogs. But it is worrying. What can we say to them? We can say these are political decisions, and I was glad I didn't have to take the question that was thrown at Jeremy about how do we persuade our politicians actually to think more ethically. It is one of the big challenges that we have, and it's one of the things that we are increasingly thinking about, and where our partnership working is increasingly helpful to us. We know, for instance, that we are setting up partnerships in the UK and elsewhere for Afghanis once we can get them out, once they can come out. With Ukraine, it's the same thing, but under martial law, of course, men between 18 and 60 cannot leave. Many women don't want to leave. They want to get their children out, their elderly relatives out, but then they want to resist as well. But the places will be here for them. And that is something that we can increasingly do, but it's not enough. And I think one of the things of being in Cara is a sense of how do we develop more agency when what we feel almost every day is our impotence. And we do have agency, we just need to be able to mobilize it a bit more. As Jeremy pointed out, the number of applications has just skyrocketed. It is quite astonishing, by almost a factor of 9. But it's not just that. It's the fact that we are dealing now with increasingly complex issues. Dealing with Ukraine is completely different from dealing with Afghanistan. It's completely different from dealing with people from Hong Kong. And that is one thing where the more people who are working with us, the more perspectives are being, and more lights are being shone onto our practices. So we're very grateful to everyone for what they're doing. the Secretary General of the United Nations was mentioned, but I'd actually like to go back to a former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, who, as you will all know, was a passionate advocate of changing the way that we think about migration. And he wrote at one point, and I've always found this enormously moving, that for him, migration is, as he puts it, an expression of human dignity, of safety, and of a better future. It is the expression of the human aspiration for dignity, for safety, and a better future. That is what all our fellows want. That's what we all want for ourselves, but it's what the fellows want in much more real and much more visceral ways. And our mission at Cara will always be to do what we can to ensure that the forced migration of our fellows finally results in them finding some kind of dignity, some kind of safety, and a better academic and personal future in the sanctuary of a UK university. Thank you for all that you have been doing. Thank you for all the compassion that you show. But we do need more help. There has to be a pitch for money. Please help us more if you can, individually through our 10 by 20 campaign, where what we're hoping to do is actually get 10% of people working in universities to give £20 per year. 3-4 cups of coffee, but £20 just a year, that's all we ask. If we do that, we can transform the scale of what we're doing. But also, if you can, we have so much need of the mentoring schemes that we're now rolling out, both in our fellowship program and in the Syria program. And again, as Jeremy pointed out in his lecture, mentorship is such a precious gift to give to the people that we work with, and especially to younger people. So thank you very much, everyone, for what you're doing. And now we just need to hand over to depart. But I hand over to Julie first, who's going to close everything for us. But thank you again, Jeremy.
So thank you, Michael, for those really interesting and reflective closing remarks. All it remains for me to do is to thank you all for being here in person, to thank those watching online for tuning in, to say that those of you who are here in person may enjoy refreshments, which will be through the door at the back, and I'm sorry that those of you online will not be able to. But the final thanks for today need to go, of course, to Jeremy for a magisterial and inspiring talk, for being so generous with his time in taking questions from right across the spectrum, and for giving us his wisdom. It's been a privilege to be here, Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Okay,